much too complex, too complex, much too complex, too complex, too complex, too complex.
Good afternoon. My name is James K. Holder II. Some of you may know me as Sir James II. I'd like to welcome you back to Not on My Watch. As always, I'd like to ask you to like, share, comment, and subscribe. I want you to retweet this and repeat this video. If you're watching, today is Friday, May 18th, 2018, and it is the last day to early vote in the Georgia gubernatorial primary. Now, this is a primary that's being held for, obviously, the office of the governor. It is currently, the current governor of Georgia is Nathan Deal. He's basically at his term limit. So if there's a chance for, and he's a Republican, if there's a chance to flip the governorship in parties, this is it. So this primary is going to be actually held on Tuesday, May 22nd. So make sure that if you haven't early voted by today, that you plan ahead and check the My Voter page at mvp.sos.ga.gov for your most up-to-date information on where to vote early. And if you're voting on Tuesday, you can also find your information there as well. Now, again, this race is going to be held on Tuesday. That's when we'll actually see the votes come in and hopefully the results. On the GOP side, there are candidates such as Brian Kemp, Casey Cagle, and Michael Williams, among others. And on the Democratic side, we're primarily choosing between Stacey Abrams and Stacey Evans. So this video is not much of it's just sort of an overall assessment of the Democratic side. I'm going to talk a little bit about the GOP candidates. Many of you know I've already been a supporter of Stacey Abrams, so it's not going to be a big to-do about who this is between. This video I am calling the Battle of the Staceys, only because that has been the presentation on the Democratic side. And I will go through a lot of the information that we've seen, whether it's via media, advertising, funding, just all of the background of this race so that you'll know. I will say that one really good resource for information about the primary as a whole, whether you're looking at GOP candidates in Georgia or Democratic candidates in Georgia, is the Wikipedia page for the 2018 gubernatorial primary. So that will be linked here. A lot of the data and polling information that I'm going to source did come from that page originally. So let's talk just briefly about the GOP candidates. One, it's just a clown show, right? You've got Brian Kemp, who is the current Secretary of State for Georgia. Now, Secretary of State obviously handles elections. He's kind of the elections CEO. Brian Kemp has sort of positioned himself in two really traditionally GOP fronts. One being that he is pro-gun. He has appeared in an ad that runs online and on television that features him holding a shotgun to a young gentleman, Quarter, who is seeking to date one of his teenage daughters. Now, he has two teenage daughters. They are presented in this visual. And it really is a sad time in 2018 when we're looking at high school students being presented as the potential victims of gun violence over this same must protect the white girl visual. I think that's been used by that party for so many times. Typically it's used against black people, or black men rather, but we'll see. He's stoking that alive and well. And then also Brian Kemp just has a record of voter suppression in the state of Georgia. I mean, dating even back to as recent as the Georgia Elk 6 race, the runoff between John Ossoff and, I don't even remember her name. She won, but I don't remember her name, but doesn't matter. In that race, there was a lawsuit that was filed among a number of plaintiffs, the New Georgia Project, which was because the state of Georgia, led by Brian Kemp, was not allowing new registrants in the district, the Georgia 6th District, congressional district, to register within the 30-day window to participate in the runoff election. And what they were trying to do is say that if you weren't eligible to vote in the original election, that you were not eligible to vote in the runoff election. And that is not what the full protection of the voting rights demands. So that lawsuit went forward, and they were successful. Casey Cagle is the current front-runner in the race. He is the lieutenant governor of Georgia, and many of you know Casey Cagle because he is the one who actually threatened Delta Airlines to punish them for when they sided with victims of the Stoneman Douglas shooting in Florida, or the Parkland massacre shooting, and then said that because Delta Airlines had said that they would rescind their discount status for NRA members, Casey Cagle vowed retaliation. Now, in the state of Georgia, that caused a lot of commotion because Georgia is still actively competing to be a potential host of the new Amazon headquarters. And that would mean a lot of economics viability for the region, let alone the state. So that was a big deal. And obviously Georgia being, Atlanta being the hub for Delta Airlines was a big deal. So in addition to that, he ran ads featuring police officers, prominently featuring jails, promoting this idea of lock more people up. And really, I think there's bipartisan consensus that what we want to be doing is reducing the number of convictions, reducing the number of prison sentences, and that we want to be moving things in the opposite direction. So you can see where Casey Cagle is on that. Michael Williams is just the bozo of the group. Now, this is the fool with the deportation bus advertising. I had thought that I was going to originally link these ads. I don't want to promote their nonsense. I don't want to contribute to their views in any way. So if you want to Google any of these bozos and see what their ads are about, you can do that on your own time. Michael Williams is a full effing fool, and he's the one with the deportation bus that broke down before it even got off the ground. He's the one who just got banned from the Cracker Barrel, of all places. Now, if you're a white man in America and you get banned from the Cracker Barrel, that's bad form. Like, that's when you know you are just over and beyond aggressively stupid, ignorant, racist, bigoted, and need to stop. So I'm really hoping that voters in Georgia will, one, elect a Democratic candidate, as opposed to any of these clowns. And there are several other clowns in this race, but Casey Cagle happens to be the front runner. Now to talk briefly about the standing of the Democratic candidates and also who they are. So we have two Democratic candidates. One is Stacey Abrams, one is Stacey Evans. Now, I will talk at length about these two candidates, but I first want to just lay out where their standing is amid the crowd. Of the latest polling, this is a poll that was taken actually this week. It was within the last 5 days. You had Stacey Abrams polling at 58% to Stacey Evans at 19%. And this is the Democratic voters. This was a sample size of about 500 voters. So not a huge pool, but in terms of the Democrats in Georgia, in a state like Georgia, it's a substantial, significant amount, especially with such a broad gap. And of those polled, 23% were still undecided. So that will let you know one thing. Currently, in a general election matchup, and this is, again, estimated based on things that we know, they're only doing, most media is only doing general election matchups against Casey Cagle as opposed to the other candidates. So Casey Cagle, as compared to Stacey Abrams, both are at a disadvantage, but Stacey Abrams is polling 1 point higher against Casey Cagle than Stacey Evans is. So that's just a few things to keep in mind. Either Democratic candidate will be seen as the underdog at the end of this primary. As of right now, Stacey Abrams is the front runner of the two candidates. So let's talk briefly about the background of Stacey Abrams. Stacey Abrams was born in Mississippi. She's like from a small city in Mississippi, so southern, fairly rural. She is the former minority leader of the Georgia House of Representatives. So she served in that position, or she served in the House of Representatives for about 7 or 8 years. She served in that position for a while as well, and so she has a lot of legislation tied to her from that time. She is, like I said, originally from Mississippi. She is an alumnus of Spelman College, which is a historically black college in the Atlanta area. Is a very big, most people know Spelman College, but in Atlanta, Spelman is a very, very big deal. And then she went to University of Texas, Austin, for her graduate study. Now, I think she has a master's in policy. I don't know what her master's is in, but she went to UT for that. Now, as a result, she has a significant amount of student loan debt as well as IRS debt. Now, the IRS debt, you can't blame that on college, but she does have, I think, about $50,000 owed in back taxes to the IRS that she has on a payment plan. And it's like 2 years of back taxes, but she's been sort of paying that off. Or she's on an arrangement with them to pay it off. So it's not like she's like delinquent in back taxes to the IRS, but she effectively made a payment arrangement with them because she had some family expenses that came up that she had to take care of. Now, and I think she has approximately $150,000 in student loan debt, which for someone who attended undergraduate at Spelman and then graduate at UT Austin, and you're not, one is a private school and then the other is a public school but in an out-of-state position, it's not unreasonable to understand how you could amass a debt of $150,000 even if you were paying some of those expenses up front. Now, Stacey Evans, by contrast, is, and Stacey Abrams is black, by the way. She's single also, and that has contributed to a lot of people seeing her in a negative sense in terms of the traditional candidates for governor. Not only are you running as a woman and will be the first woman elected in Georgia, you will be the first black woman to be elected a governor in the country, and you're single. So that's sort of one point of contention for her candidacy. Now let's talk about Stacey Evans. Stacey Evans is, they're about the same age, I think. Stacey Evans might be a little bit younger. They're both in their 40s. Stacey Evans is originally from Georgia. She makes that very clear every time she speaks. So she is a current state representative from Georgia. She attended UGA for both her master's, for her undergrad and her JD. So she has a law degree. She's an attorney. She won a big Medicaid fraud lawsuit. And as a result, she earned the majority of her net worth, which is $5.2 million. This is someone who has so far donated $1.5 million to her own candidacy. And now, I bring up all those numbers because there's, on one hand, it's a bit of a long shot for either of them, correct? But you have Stacey Evans, who is significantly self-funded, not fully self-funded, but it raises the question, if you're going to be self-funded, do you really have the resources, if you've already spent a quarter of your net worth to run a campaign, and now a week out of the actual election, you are only polling at 19%. You're polling under undecided at this point. Then what is really your motivation at this point? So we'll talk about motivation via the debate recap. So this is the debate recap portion. I am referring specifically to the Atlanta Press Club's Young Loudermilk debate. Now, this occurred on May 15th. It became available online at the link that is in the description below. And this is published on Georgia Public Broadcasting. So this is like the most neutral of all sources. It's not liberal, it's not progressive. It's not liberal, it's not GOP. It's just like sort of a neutral territory. So you really don't get much more generic than this in Georgia. I've jotted down a few notes, so I'm going to go over those sort of in chronological order. One of the first things I noticed is that when the candidates introduced themselves, or rather when they were introduced by the panel, The panelists went on sort of an exhaustive resume rundown of Stacey Abrams, including the fact she was the first leader, she was the first female of any party to lead the House or Senate. She was also the first black, I believe, minority leader for the Georgia House of Representatives. So those were things that were mentioned in her resume. When it came to Stacey Evans, it was just like, and Stacey Evans. Like, it really was that she is a current member of the House of Representatives in the state of Georgia. So I thought that was interesting. One contrast between the two candidates that came up very early is that Stacey Evans did originally support the Opportunity School Districts Act. Now, this was put to a referendum in the 2016 race, and that was big because it really had to do with visually a wealth transfer between public and private schools in the form of either vouchers or some other charter school setup, something where the DeVos aspect of education in K through 12. Now, this is something that you could probably look up more. Many of the organizations that support progressive policies were against this particular act. Stacey Abrams voted against this act, and Stacey Evans supported it. Now, Evans later brought up the fact that Stacey Abrams was not endorsed by Keisha, or that Stacey Abrams did not endorse Keisha Lance Bottoms in the Atlanta mayoral race. I thought that was interesting only because it was somewhat expected that Stacey Abrams would endorse Keisha, which is ironic because most people in Atlanta were not super pro Keisha Lance Bottoms. Keisha Lance Bottoms won by a narrow victory. She did not get a groundswell of support by anybody. She didn't get a lot of support by former mayors. She didn't get a lot of support within the progressive establishment. So if we're talking about the Bernie wing, Bernie Sanders did not endorse Keisha Lance Bottoms. Many people felt she was too close to Kasim Reed and too close to that brand of corruption. People like Vincent Fort, who have endorsed Stacey Evans, have come out and endorsed, actually at the time, after Vincent Fort was a candidate for mayor in Atlanta. He was one of the sort of progressive champions or considered a progressive champion and a supporter of fair and affordable housing in the state of Georgia. Now, Vincent Fort, after he lost in contention for the mayor's race, he then endorsed Keisha Lance Bottoms' former Republican, now independent competitor, Mary Norwood. Now, I thought that was interesting because this same person now endorsed Stacey Evans, and now Stacey Evans is asking this Stacey Abrams why she didn't endorse Keisha Lance Bottoms when many people consider progressives did not. Let's move on forward to, and I might bring up Vincent Ford a little bit later because, but I do want to go just chronologically at things that I noticed in the actual debates. So another one was State Bill or SB or Senate Bill 350. Now this was a gun bill from the Georgia legislature, and this is one that basically Evans supported and then later walked back her support for it. As a result of things like that, it is seen now publicly that sort of Stacey Evans has a more questionable position on resisting sort of the gun culture of Georgia. Now, when it came up in a discussion, Stacey Evans talked about her child having to go through gun safety drills or intruder drills, and how she really stuck on an emotional thread. And this was a constant theme in her presentation throughout discussing why she should be the governor of Georgia. She talked about growing up poor. She talked about watching her mom being abused and being glad that there was no gun in the house because something could have been worse, and that Georgia's children shouldn't witness their parents being abused. Everything she seemed to tie very closely back to a thread about sort of this preserving white women and children, and it again, it's something that plays, that is used on both sides. You saw this in the Brian Kemp ad. You know what I mean? Like, so that is a sort of string that she continued to pull at. Stacey Abrams is actually endorsed by Gabrielle Giffords. So that's something, and Gabrielle Giffords, of course, is the victim of gun violence who was in Congress and then had to then basically take a step back. She's recuperated fairly well, but she's very much a very big gun legislation advocate and gun safety advocate. So that is an important delineation between the two. Now, throughout the presentation, Stacey Evans continually drew a very specific contrast between her and Stacey Abrams that I didn't really like. When they introduced the two candidates, they asked them sort of fairly basic questions to start it off, and Stacey Evans did not answer her question. She immediately went into her bio about being from Georgia, growing up poor, going to the University of Georgia because she was afforded the Hope Scholarship, and how it was a travesty that Stacey Abrams voted against the Hope Scholarship and ripped it from so many black children. That was her entire synopsis for an opening statement, which was a response to a question that had really nothing to do with the Hope Scholarship, education, or black children. I thought that was interesting. It seems like Stacey Evans is doing the most to continually focus on things like Hope Scholarship, continually focus on things like the University of Georgia, because what it allows her to do is really brand herself as the real Georgian in the competition. Again, Stacey Abrams is not from Georgia. She did go to college in Georgia. She's been working in government in Georgia, but she's not, born and raised in Georgia. And so I think a big part of Stacey Evans's approach this is to paint Abrams is in some way other or outside of the box, which I don't know how successful that is because Stacey Abrams is so much more popular here, as evidenced by the polls, the recent polling. So I thought that was interesting. One very important delineation that came up in this debate was the question of basically if you are the governor and you have to take legislative action or executive action against an order by the president. They asked specifically both candidates what would be one example of something Trump has already done or proposed that if you were already serving as governor of Georgia that you would have worked to resist, and how would you have done it? Stacey Evans gave an answer that revolved around basically not allowing Donald Trump to become president again. So it really focused on preventing him from being reelected, which I don't really know how she would go about doing that as the governor of the state of Georgia, which is expected to perform as a red state through and through. I mean, obviously Donald Trump won the state of Georgia. The only Democratic candidate that's ever won the state of Georgia before was, I mean, don't get me wrong, I mean, modernly is Jimmy Carter, and that's because he's from Georgia. So, oh, and I think Bill Clinton won Georgia in one of the races, but it really wasn't like Georgia is a contender for these races. So that came up. That was Stacey Evans' answer. Stacey Abrams' answer specifically mentioned she would refuse to send National Guards from Georgia to the border in place of a border wall. That was one. She also specifically said that she would reject the Muslim ban and fight against that. And I thought those were two very key points. Like, I really was very proud that recognizing that Georgia has the busiest airport in the world, I mean, in Hartsfield-Jackson, that she did mention the Muslim ban because that was a huge deal, and that is something that as governor of Georgia, you would have some power over. And then, of course, the National Guard for the border, that was also very important. Evans basically kind of, again, didn't answer the question. One other thing is that Evans seems to be one thing I did like about Stacey Evans in the debate is that she was the only one who, unprovoked, brought up Georgia's burgeoning film industry. And I thought that was important because that's a huge deal here. But it came to a very, very, nickel and dimes conversation about tax incentives in general, like tax incentives for companies, and how would you regulate what tax incentives were worth continuing to hand out and offer to companies like Amazon, companies like that operate within the film industry. And then both of them gave similar answers, but that would be one that you would have to look for yourself. Now, I think one thing you do have to understand between these two candidates, and this is just sort of a general assessment of the two candidates based on what I saw in that debate. Evans seems to be education focused. Her driving message is that Georgians' biggest concern and fear is that they won't have access to opportunity because they don't have access to college and technical college, like full college, four-year university, and also technical college as a resource. And that as a result of cuts to the Hope Scholarship, it basically disqualifies her opponent, Stacey Abrams, because of the deal that Stacey Abrams made with the majority party at the time to essentially preserve pre-K and Hope Scholarship in a diminished state than what it had been before. Now, it is important to note that the GOP had enough votes basically at that time to fully gut the Hope Scholarship and eliminate the program altogether. And Stacey Abrams worked hard enough to keep it so that basically there were some other provisions, additional provisions that were allowed, that were removed, but it basically didn't diminish anyone's ability to keep the scholarship if you maintained a 3.0 average or a B average. So that's, again, one of those hairy things. You'd have to make a decision based on that. But to me, I have viewed that in the ad coverage of the election that Stacey Abrams' record on Hope Scholarship was misrepresented. I think that Stacey Evans leads with this because, one, it paints her as an insider because she's from Georgia. No one would ask Stacey Abrams if she got the Hope Scholarship because she wasn't from here. And so being tied to Hope, that's a very popular bill or a piece of legislation, actually does help. They did discuss projections in lottery revenue and other things that contribute to the Hope Scholarship. All of that is in the debate. I definitely recommend that you watch it. Stacey Evans also seemed to be very much pro incentives for larger companies. So she kept talking about tax incentives for companies like Amazon, larger incentives for and ongoing incentives for the film industry. She was pro, when asked, hypothetical, she was pro sports gambling. Basically, she seemed to have a broader aspect on the business side. Stacey Abrams, by contrast, seems to focus most of her approach to Georgia's main concerns with Medicaid expansion. Now, this is something that, in a referendum, Georgians voted down in 2016. So it is not, it is popular, but not popular enough in the form of a referendum. But if with Medicaid expansion, Stacey is basically trying to build a coalition around veteran families, military families, and people in rural communities who have seen their hospitals, their local hospitals shut down because of lack of funding and primarily due to the lack of expansion of Medicaid. Now, Stacey's approach to describing why this would be a big problem solver revolves around, one, the fact that it will provide better health care for all Georgians, but two, it will also provide jobs within multiple regions and bridge a bigger gap. Stacey is also very focused on transit as a big part of her discussion as it relates to allowing people in rural communities to have more access and also disabled people to have more access to things like paratransit that would allow them to get public transit accessible. And we know that in Georgia, that's a big problem. She also seemed to be more targeted on small business. And as opposed to offering tax incentives for large businesses, Stacey Abrams seemed to be focused much more on providing access to capital for small businesses. She talked specifically about legislation and programming that former President Barack Obama had and made accessible to people in the state of Georgia that she even took advantage of. And there was, again, another there was a misrepresentation of what Stacey Abrams' participation in that program was, and it's been painted as she took dark money in exchange for so and so and so. So again, if you watch it, it's all clarified in that debate, but I do recommend that you watch it. And also, she did specify that she would want to hold the recipients of tax breaks in the event of like Amazon or other companies getting these large tax breaks, that you keep it on a probationary period basis, basically, where periodically every year you check and see what the returns are on those tax incentives. And if the tax incentives given out don't match or exceed, if it's not worth the return on investment, Stacey Abrams is basically saying you shouldn't keep getting tax incentives if they don't provide value to residents of Georgia. So that's where they stand on those two things. As far as endorsements from outside, Stacey Abrams, and let me just do Stacey Evans first, because she had a much smaller list of endorsements. Stacey Evans was endorsed by the last Democratic governor of Georgia, Roy Barnes. She is also endorsed by Vincent Ford. She's endorsed by a sprinkling of former and current representatives and senators within the state, but it's very much a small amount of support. Stacey Abrams has a lot more support from established Democrats within the party, and even some outsiders. Now, this is a list that's composed on the Wikipedia page for the primary. You can see a list of everyone that has pledged support to one of the candidates in both sides of the primary. But this is the list from Abrams, and this is a partial list. Abrams had a much longer list of endorsements than Stacey Evans, including Cory Booker, Kamala Harris, Bernie Sanders, Our Revolution, Nina Turner, John Lewis, the Georgia AFL-CIO, Emily's List, Move On, NARAL, and also Planned Parenthood. So if endorsements are something that, determine who you will support, then those groups very much would allow you to believe that this candidate is someone that you could get behind. As I stated before, I had previously publicly supported Stacey Abrams. I've been personally impressed by her story, by seeing her activism with groups that I work with personally. So I work directly with the New Georgia Project. I volunteered for them on a number of projects. They're a group that's dear to my heart, and she has worked with them to help register a significant number of voters in the state of Georgia. Many of you who watched the show from season 1, there was a very big episode that I did called "The State of Georgia versus the Resistance," and in that episode I interviewed Nsé Ufot, who is the executive director of the New Georgia Project. Nsé Ufot is someone who I regard very highly in the electoral process, especially in the state of Georgia, and so she has also endorsed Stacey Abrams. And so my endorsement for the Georgia gubernatorial race is going to be for Stacey Abrams all day. Now, Stacey Evans, of course, if she were to win the primary election, I will support her in November. I do find that there seems to be a motivation within the Stacey Evans campaign to draw contrasts in a way based on racial lines. I have not liked what I've seen from Stacey Evans' campaigns. There was the taping that she did at Ebenezer Baptist Church, and the Ebenezer people came back and said that she wasn't really allowed or authorized to tape a commercial in the sanctuary during worship. I didn't like that she had a visual of herself transitioning over a picture of the Honorable Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. I thought that was beyond sort of the line. And then it just seemed like she felt entitled to go in and tape at this black church and utilize the imagery of MLK to present herself as the next MLK and a candidate. And I just don't see that for her. I'm fine with her personal story. I think that it's too much based on sympathy, and it's not really based on a series of legislative accomplishments. I don't like the line of attacks against Stacey Abrams that she has been participating in and engaging in. I think the type of attacks that progressive candidates or seemingly progressive candidates, because they have enough money to self-fund in part or in whole, tends to be this assumption or assertion that the person who has to go through traditional fundraising methods to run a campaign is corrupt somehow or untrustworthy. I don't like that. As a default, I don't like that. And so I think that I have been sort of turned off by a lot of what I've seen from Stacey Abrams, and still, even if she wins in November, even if she wins next week, I will support her in November. We shall all hope that Stacey Abrams will endorse Stacey Abrams if she doesn't win, and vice versa, but there's no guarantee on things like that anymore. If you want to vote early, your last opportunity to vote early in the state of Georgia is today, Friday, May 18th. You can visit the My Voter page, which is mvp.sos.ga.gov, to find out where your early voting location is. And if you want to vote on the day of the election, which is Tuesday, May 22nd, you can also find your information for your polling location there. Please make sure to check your polling location before you go out to vote, because you will not be able to vote in some of any location. Also, Georgia is an open primary state, so if you're not a registered Democrat, that is no sweat. You will be asked which ballot you'd like to have when you arrive at the polling location. So that is not something you have to worry about for this. As always, if you have any questions about this particular topic, please comment below. I know it's a bit urgent. I did want to wait till I had the most up-to-date information before I did this episode, because it is basically exhaustive and based on what I've seen online and via ads, and also in the debates that happened just 2 days ago. Now, I want to thank our friend of the show. As always, if you'd like to become a friend of the show, you can make a donation to the PayPal link, www.paypal.me/jkh2. And without further ado, donations to the show allow me to buy anything that goes to producing this show. Also, The Counter TV, which is launching its second season soon. I need as much support with that show as possible. And also our weekly digest, The Weekend 10. So I'd encourage you to support the shows in any way that you can. Donations as small as $1 allow me to buy coffee. Donations higher than $100 will be featured as producer-level sponsors on The Counter when Season 2 premieres next month. I want to thank Elizabeth C., Gabby D., Elizabeth W., Carole D., Laura C., and also Karen B. Thank you all so much for watching. Make sure to get out and vote in the Georgia gubernatorial primary, and there's also several other key elections that are happening this week. So make sure you get educated, get informed, and exercise your right to vote. As always, I'd like to ask you to relax, relate, and resist. Thank you.
Too complex, much too complex, too complex, much too